is Paul Lehr. I'm an original content provider with valortube.com, and I've got with me Czekmate this evening. He also is an original content provider at valortube.com. We've been discussing the happenings going on in Russia, as well as what's taken place in Eastern Europe, specifically on the border of the Ukraine and Russia. And what this boils down to is Ezekiel's prophecies in chapters 38 and 39. And the cliff notes of that would be is that Russia, ancient Magog, which we believe to be modern day Russia, is going to be joined by the countries of Iran, Turkey, Libya, Sudan, arguably the Ethiopia, and they're going to come and invade Israel from the north and come in through the mountains. Scripture, Ezekiel's pretty clear about that. Now, specifically what we're looking at this evening is we go to Ezekiel chapter 39, verses 9 through 12. I'll read those real quick and have a little bit of commentary as we go through this. Then those who dwell in the cities of Israel will go out, kindle fires, and burn up the weapons, the bucklers and shields, the bows and arrows, the clubs and spears. And this is the part that's pretty significant and frankly pretty impressive. For 7 years, they will use them for fuel. So Israel's going to have 7 years worth of fuel that they're going to use based on the weapons that are left over from this pending invasion from Russia and friends. They will not gather wood from the countryside or cut it from the forest, for they will use the weapons for fuel. They will loot those who looted them and plunder those who plundered them, declares God. And again, this will speak to the magnitude of the buildup of what's coming. This is verse 11, Ezekiel 39, verse 11. And on that day I will give Gog, that's the leader of Magog in these countries, a burial place in Israel, the Valley of the Travelers, east of the sea. It will block those who travel through, because Gog and all his hordes will be buried there. So it will be called the Valley of Hamon-gog. For 7 months, the house of Israel will be burying them in order to cleanse the land. And I'm going to stop right there. And there are a couple of things taking place. One, it's going to take seven months for these people, all the dead, to be buried. Now, granted, there's some legal aspects of that in the Jewish law, not touching dead bodies. And we're going to make sure, that everybody's ceremonially clean and the land is ceremonially cleaned. But I think that also could potentially allude to some sort of exchange between two powers that would be, there's a lot of dead people there. And moving on down, all the people of the land will bury them, and it will bring them renown. On the day I display my glory, declares the Lord. Verse 14, and men will be employed to continually pass through the land to cleanse it by burying the invaders who remain on the ground. At the end of 7 months, they will begin their search. As they pass through the land, anyone who sees a human bone will set up a pillar next to it until the grave diggers have buried them in the Valley of Hamon-gog. And so they will cleanse the land. And I know Czekmate and I discussed this earlier in the day. And before we get to the geography of the situation, I thought we would start at this area. And maybe this is a stretch on my part, but to me, that speaks to some of the weaponry that could be used in an exchange like this. And this is where I would turn it over to Czekmate and get his insights and analysis on these types of issues.
Well, good evening, Paul the Poke. How are you?
I'm doing good. I appreciate you joining me this evening.
Well, it's my pleasure, and it's nice to do something collaborative after the number of exchanges we've had via Electron and voice. And I think this is a very fruitful thing to discuss, because I didn't have any real revelations about Ezekiel 39 until something that you just said just this moment ago about grave registration during a post-nuclear exchange. So I think that this is an interesting topical thing.
So when you see something like that, and I know this is where you would have more insight into the type of weapons that would be utilized during an exchange that would that would lend to the idea that's talked about here in verse 14, where you got people employed to essentially look for specific, dead, even to the point where there's just human bone left and there's no body. What types of things? How is that plausible in today's world?
Really, I think what you're talking about is a tactical nuclear weapon where a body has been left on the field for a while. It does not make much sense for a biological weapon, a chemical weapon, because with chemical weapons, generally a body turns to goo and it decomposes. With respect to a tactical nuclear weapon, it'll burn you to a crisp to the point that you're just not sentient any longer as a piece of flesh, and somebody would just fall in place, and if they're not dead, they'll be wishing they were dead for the excruciating few moments that they're left alive after that. The idea that bone would be left there and we've got a 7-year period tells me is that the contamination is persistent enough that you can only send a few people at a time there to go in there who've got the appropriate gear, the appropriate decontaminant. And I think that given how deep Orthodox Christendom runs within the Russian military, that would be a thing that certainly Jewish soldiers who were burying dead, that they would be willing to respect. That even though they fought us, we have to bury them where they fell, kind of thing.
Interesting, very interesting. So as I read that, and it talks about in verse 11, and on that day I will give Gog a burial place in Israel, the Valley of the Travelers, east of the sea. So there are a couple of options there. You'd probably be looking at either the Sea of Galilee, which is where most of this is where they're going to enter from, in the mountains. That's where the mountains are in the north, through what would be western Syria, Lebanon, arguably Turkey, just to the north, and then come down through what would be Jordan, and then down to the Dead Sea. That would be my understanding. Do you agree with that? Is that plausible? Does that make sense, and so forth?
I would be inclined to agree, just because it would seem to me that God would want finality in one of the places where it all began. But I'm quickly getting out of my core competency at that point. What I would argue is that if it's east of the sea and it's the Sea of Galilee or it's the Dead Sea, it would tell me that the Transjordan has become a controversy. With respect to the sea being the Mediterranean, of course, that's the obvious one. But with respect to the Transjordan, we've seen some geopolitical shifts going on within the Hashemite kingdom that runs Jordan, where the queen, the wife of the current reigning king, has attempted an unofficial gambit, if you will, to bring Palestinians much more on side, and the Palestinian cause much more on side within the borders of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. And since I think about 1995, 96, there's been a peace treaty in effect. I should know this off the top of my head because I talked with a Jordanian when they concluded it. But since 1995, 1996, there's been a peace treaty between the Israelis and the Jordanians, and it's been, in the Israeli perception, steadily eroding in favor of the Palestinian cause, and by extension, because the Iranians are the primary benefactors currently of the Palestinian cause, you end up in a situation where the Iranians have become the swing player with respect to any Russian attempt to get into Israel. The Iranians right now, as things stand, and I've done videos on this, you've done videos on this, they're the swing player in terms of the muscle that Israel faces. In terms of a Russian incursion, diplomatically, they could leverage those relationships that exist. Maybe not outright using the Palestinian cause, maybe so doing with the Palestinian cause, but to move to the left, coming from the northeast along the eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee. what you would be talking about is something where Jordan got dragged in, or Jordan just stepped away from its responsibility over those lands, as well as the Syrians. The Syrians just gave up.
Very interesting. Very interesting. So I was going to take a look too. The thing that has always struck me about this particular prophecy is just the volume of weaponry that would have to be amassed that would allow Israel to burn weapons, which for 7 years to use their fuel. Now, to me, that also would imply some sort of weapon, arguably a nuclear weapon, a nuclear weapon that just did not explode, and it's just laying there to be used. Just the volume of weapons that is there, and I guess my question would be: does it stand to reason? Is it plausible that you probably would have some unexploded ordnance that Israel would be able to convert to fuel, and what would that look like as you would see it?
There's that, but there's also molecular separation technologies that are in the works. Having been in the defense threat reduction arena, albeit from the diplomatic side of things, we're really approaching a pretty exciting point if the environmental movement can kind of, separate itself a little bit, and sort of suspend passion for a moment. Not in, and what I'm not advocating here is compromising what it is they believe in so much as look at things a little bit differently. One of the things that we're looking at in terms of molecular separation is being able to decontaminate something in such a way that you recapture the usefulness of those molecules and those electrons, in the sense that you could recapture in a nuclear ridden battlefield, albeit slowly, energy.
Very good. So I guess this would take us to where we kind of stand right now. I mean, so obviously there is not a massive force led by Russia that's in the Middle East or in the Promised Land that would amount to the amount, or that would amount to the volume of troops, weapons, and so forth that are described in Ezekiel 39. But what has happened over the last week is there has been a significant troop movement by the Russians, essentially from west to east. And then that's where I would, just the sheer number of what's being done. That's where really would like to hear your insight and analysis on this particular situation. And if they were to drop these troops, south into Israel, would this be plausible? Would this make sense to see what we're seeing? But before we get there, just explain a little bit to people what's going on in and around Russia and the implications of that from a geopolitical standpoint.
Well, the cynic in me wants to say that Putin has read our current occupant of the White House, and I believe that the outlook in that regard is he understands that the people surrounding Mr. Biden are very interested in setting him up for success as a peacemaker. Well, in order to be a peacemaker, you have to have a war to break out. Otherwise, your definition changes from being a peacemaker to a peacekeeper if you prevent war from breaking out. I truly believe that Vladimir Putin has detected a certain amount of give in the United States position, and that his intent at this point is he's going to play it for all it's worth and take as much of Ukraine as he can, because he has had since 2014 to set up a number of partisan forces in areas that are considered Russophone. By Russophone, what I mean is that through the period of Joseph Stalin from the 1930s onward, there's been a steady Russian influence in the culture of these countries that are on the Russian border. And what they developed them into are political factions that would take the side, or be disposed to take the side, of Russian special operations troops who move into these areas. For example, in Ukraine, in the Donetsk region. what we end up with in all of this is we end up with the Russians really don't need to commit their own infantry because where the Russians stand, they've had some difficulties with respect to committing their own infantry. They can commit artillery, they can commit air power, they can do all of the big picture stuff. When in reality, the White House in Washington, D.C. wants to be seen as a peace broker. And I think Putin knows it. I think he's going to play it, and I think he's going to get everything he can out of it. And if Joe Biden gets his peace program, who cares?
So at the core of this, though, Putin wants to lever up the Ukraine. Is it fair to say that it's over natural resources, specifically oil and gas, because he wants to control the commerce, shall we say, what's sold to Western Europe? Is that a fair assessment?
That's a fair assessment. I would add to it that the Russian general staff has always had a thing about strategic space between them and their nearest peer adversary. What they want is a distance between their T-90 tanks, which do not perform as advertised, and M1A2 tanks, which can make dog meat of them on the battlefield. They want that strategic space because if you look at the Napoleonic War and you look at World War II, strategic space is how they won wars. The other thing is that there is, some people would call it jingoistic, there is a nostalgia for a greater Russia, and that is very definitely in play.
So almost kind of like putting the old Soviet Union back together again. Is that accurate?
In a sense, I think it's got a more czarist model because a lot of these people who are nostalgic for an older Russia, they understand the flaws of the Soviet model, but they also understand that they, in a sense, got played when the Soviet Union formed. They kind of look at the Western model of free markets. They look at that as a fixed game, and they want to play it harder.
Okay. So when you look at, a little bit about what's going on with the troop movements, how significant is this? Because we see stuff in the press here in the West, and we don't get a lot of details on it. But a little bit about the undertaking of what's involved on behalf of the Russians, and then also would this type of troop movement, say if this were to drop south down into the Middle East, would that be enough to allow for 7 years of fuel, if you will? And just talk a little bit about the size and the scope of what's taking place here.
I think it could. I think that when we run to the scripture piece, and I'm deconstructing it a little bit backward from the question, I think that we deconstruct the spiritual piece, that 7 years of fuel is more speaking to a miraculous turnaround of weapons that were designed to kill, maim, destroy. That this would be the net result, is that these things that were intended to be murderous would, in fact, become a part of people's livelihood. The fact of the matter is that the Russian troop movements, what you're really talking about is you're talking about Cold War era stocks in terms of the Russian war machine, and leveraging those things to surge them west, as we've been seeing. Certainly, I've been dropping them on Valor Tube, and you've been speaking to them on the various videos that you've been leaving on Valor Tube. Surging them west, that in and of itself is a sign that they mean business. But the fact that they're going into Ukraine means they're that much closer to embarking a ship or being placed on a plane to get into Syria, where they already have a logistical foothold. So things are primed to go that way. And I think the other caution that I would throw out is that Ezekiel 38 and 39 is probably a multi-year prophecy, at least in terms of the Gregorian calendar. And, it may take not just one short spasmodic period, because I don't think the Russians have the legs to be able to do that, but it may take a couple of years, and that this is a summation of that couple of year period.
Yeah, absolutely. That's my take of this too. I mean, what we're seeing currently take place in my mind would be like is this the hook in the jaw that starts the motion forward for a troop buildup, or something like that to take place? Because if I remember right, the Russians first started coming into Syria about late 2015, when Syria was in civil war since about 2011 from the Arab Spring, and that's when they really got into Syria, got into Latakia, have a base there, and then they had troops down on the Golan Heights within 12 months. So I mean, I don't think we're anywhere near this being imminent from happening down in the Middle East, but the thing that strikes me about it is just the sheer volume and then an undertaking of what's happening, and you could see how something like that could, instead of it being on the border of Ukraine, it's on the border of Israel at some point in the future.
And I think that's right, because what it looks to me is happening with respect to Ukraine, what is happening with respect to their adventurism in Syria, is that they've gotten a taste of what it's like to be a successful expeditionary power. Never mind that their expeditionary forces are fighting people who are half-hearted to not committed. It doesn't matter. They're fighting, and they think they're seeing results from it because their geopolitical position is being consolidated, but it's being done by the presidential level. The tactical forces are really just a show of force. So if you look, for example, at the United States, our expeditionary example in Iraq and in Afghanistan, where we were embarrassed, they take a great deal of solace in that. So if they can pull off Ukraine using the old tactics of massed forces, imagine what would happen if they successfully win Ukraine through the other means that the Russians are known for to be able to win very well. If they achieve it through the other means, but the massed forces are there, if they were to develop an appetite, to move on to something else, and it was, for example, consolidating their hold on the natural gas industry, they would view themselves as unstoppable, having that victory under their belt. And so that's where I think you get into the hook into the jaw, that there's an economic necessity that they intervene, and they're fresh with the victory. Hey, we can do this because the Americans' hand is off the tiller. They're not paying attention.
See, and that's where, I would speculate at this point, whatever this outcome is, something is going to empower Russia to want to move south. So to me, it's almost the outcome, if you will, is pretty much what you described, in that they're going to get what they want in Ukraine and feel empowered. And, well, if I got this, because to me, as I look at the situation and their control, their appetite for carbon resources and oil and gas, there's really only two things standing between Russia and complete control of that market, and that's the Ukraine and Israel. Because they've got their fingers everywhere else. They got their fingers in Libya. That's Africa's largest producer of oil and gas. And they're going, and then if they have Ukraine, and then they, just stepped in there to help out Kazakhstan, which is a big oil gas exporter to China. I mean, they've got pretty good control of the situation, eventually save one, and that'll be Israel. And they've got a pile of natural gas sitting out there in the Mediterranean. So
they do, and make no mistake, the real eventual standoff here is that in the case of Russia and China, is they're really just putting off the big fight, which is between the two of them. There's always been a contest between these two peoples for control of the approaches into Western Europe. And when you look at the Belt and Road Initiative, it's pretty well in your face exactly what the Chinese have in mind. They're just very polite about it, and they have their panda huggers who they've paid for throughout the world. But the Russians have no illusions about who these people are, what they want, and they don't want them in their backyard. And so this is them really checkmating the Chinese, but they're on cordial terms at the moment. I don't think they could ever really conclude a solid alliance, even though things like the Shanghai Cooperation Initiative. I don't think they could ever really and truly cooperate something out of an alliance of convenience. Nothing long-standing like NATO, I think, could ever come out of those two, because their agendas uh, diverge so comprehensively, and it's a shame on us that we have not been able to capitalize on that division.
Well, that I think that speaks to, and that's a nice little dovetail to, if you look at the key players, coalitions of countries, if you will, in the end times events. I mean, so there's going to be a group led by Russia, and I think that speaks to the group we talked about in Ezekiel 38, 39 with Turkey, Iran, Libya, and probably some of the old Soviet republics, some other nations. China's going to play a role, Revelation 9, and then also hanging out there as this 10-nation federation. And that has yet to show itself. And I also wonder to some degree, too, if Russia steps into the Ukraine, asserts itself, gets what they want, and that's also a piece of the formation of what will be a 10-nation federation. And because the United States, I just don't see is in a position of strength to be able to do what they used to do. And then there's a lot of scuttle about China from an economic perspective and the hardware associated with 5G technologies. I know it'd be the G7 plus 3, and those 3 would be India, Australia, and South Korea. Then you'd have your 10 plus if you take the G7 plus those 3, you'd have 10. And that would also kind of fit some ability to kind of keep a close eye on China from the west, from the south, and then more reinforcement from the east. And then that would, you got a buffer too against Russia. But we have yet to see that. So, and who knows what that's going to look like, but that's plausible. Seems reasonable for whatever that's worth. Didn't know if you had any thoughts on that.
I don't have any particular thoughts on that, but one of the things that I've realized is, and this is, it's amazing. My diplomatic career preceded my salvation, but what I would say is that we are living in a bizarre age where the ridiculous becomes the sublime, becomes the normal, just in a matter of weeks. I really and truly think that we're living in such fluid times right now, with the absence of the United States as the critical international actor, countries moving to ensure their own agenda without the working level of United States approval, and just presenting a fait accompli to the absent-minded White House. And I don't mean that derisively. I mean, it truly is, has the appearance of being unguided. The fact of the matter is that I look upon this right now as a number of nations, a bunch of societal forces in the entire world have been set free. And I think the people who are studying this closely most are the Israelis, the Russians, and the Chinese. And yeah, the Iranians, but they're kind of captured by their own presumptions. And same thing with some of the countries in the rest of the Middle East. But what I would argue is that things that, to me, when I read Lehane books right out of college, and I just sort of threw them against the wall and said no way, I'm like, okay, maybe this is where I am now. We're just in a free flowing world right now where the things that you and I are talking about are easily envisionable.
Well, that's the thing that blows me away is how quickly. I mean, you think about that. That wasn't that long ago when
It was a blip.
Well, I was in college in the early to mid 90s, and I remember thinking when the wall came down, I thought, well, this throws some of this stuff off track. This isn't going to happen anytime soon. And then here we are a few years later, we're moving into Iraq to liberate Kuwait, and our tanks are essentially going right up the river, clicking off places you read about in the Bible. And I'm like, well, that's kind of odd. And if anything, that was like the first domino that kind of got some of this stuff started. Here we are, what, 20, 25 years later, and look where we are. It's just the speed of it is crazy.
I completely agree. I mean, I had been to that part of the world, and the window from the office that I used to sit in when I was in southern Iraq overlooked a place called Abadan, Iran, and it was right on the Shah River. And Abadan, I came to find out through Jewish mysticism, is the gatekeeper to the gates of hell. And believe me, there were some nights where we got rocketed so badly, I felt like, yeah, okay, I'm buying that. And we had flown over areas where a lot of people believed that the gates of the Garden of Eden were, and of course that's guarded by a host now, but not visible to us in plain sight. But the fact of the matter is that all of this stuff is truly coming to a head, and you really got to be a student of history. And I think that that's the one thing I would give our leadership is that there's a lot of lip service to the lessons that we received as students and children of the one Most High God through Jesus Christ, but we're really not taking on board what exactly it was he was up against in his historical context. Because not a great deal has changed except for names and faces. The modalities and methods are still the same.
Isn't that amazing? That's just, well, that's the thing too, is it's been shocking for me as I've studied this stuff and learned about it. A lot of these places still have the same names, and you show up and we read these stories about these prophets or these different people, and they've got shrines set up where you've got both Jew and Muslim, appreciating, like with Jonah in what is modern day Mosul. Then you got all these prophets buried throughout Iraq and Iran, and those are still real places, and we just have no clue about that in the West. They're just little stories to us.
And we never know, even from our worst enemy to our most tepid friend, we never know how God is going to impact the people who have been to those places. I tend to tell people, pray the opening stanzas of Joshua that I will give you the land where your feet have trod. I know I'm butchering the citation there, but I have a buddy who was an atheist when I met him in Iraq, and he was there to keep me alive. And he was a Marine sniper, and he became a private security guy, and love him like a brother to this day. And thank God he's coming our way on the subject of faith. But I'll tell you, he was in northern Iraq, and he had to deal with watching the shrine to the prophet of Jonah being looted. And it was one of those things where all he could think was, I can take this shot and I can end this right now. And the U.S. government wouldn't let him do it.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I'll tell you what, I think that's a lot for people to digest. And do you have any thoughts on closing? Is there anything else that hits you or crosses your mind as you watch all these things starting to, as you say, come to a head, as we're watching history kind of be revealed, if you will?
It may sound cavalier, but pop your popcorn. And the reason that I say that is that I don't think that this is going to end in 6 months, 8 months, a year. I think we're looking at, a minimum of a decade for all of this stuff to boil up. Because diplomacy is a very slow thing, and right now there's enough agreement in the international circuit that people want Joe Biden to have his win. There's enough influence in Washington that people want Joe Biden to have his win. And at the same time, Vladimir Putin, he's nobody's fool. He's exceptionally shrewd. And what he is going to do is, without having to pay a domestic political cost, try to commit as little force as possible. And he is not going to throw a bunch of infantry against the Ukrainian wall, because the Ukrainians will fight. I think what you're going to be looking for is appearances, because these people are in league with the forces of darkness, and the forces of darkness are about the perception, because perception banks heavily on deception, and perception leads to decision. And that's what Lucifer is about, is getting us to make bum decisions based on perception.
Outstanding. Outstanding. Well, with that, I will close this out. Appreciate your time. Again, please check out Czekmate, lame pun intended, on valortube.com. Has all sorts of great content for those of you who want to be wired into what's taking place in the Middle East, in Europe from a geopolitical standpoint. This is a real deal stuff. Take some courage to look around and see what's actually going on out there, and I couldn't recommend it enough. I feel very fortunate and blessed to have met this guy. Had some great conversations, and I'm sure you guys are going to be hearing from more of us in the future. And with that, I thank you, and we'll talk to you again soon. Thanks a lot. Bye.
God bless.
Thank you. You too.